On August 19th, a flatbed carrying 24 round bales turned off the county road and rolled toward the Barrett ranch. Lena Barrett walked into the drive and raised both hands. "Don't unload them." The driver leaned out his window. "This is the Barrett place, right?" "Yes, take them back." Behind him, the Nebraska Sandhills looked burned pale under a month of hot wind. Two neighboring ranches had already started feeding hay. Lena's own cattle were bawling beyond a fence line where the grass looked shorter every day, and she was sending feed away. What the driver could not see was a pasture beyond the north ridge that Lena had refused to touch since spring. For 4 months, everyone around her had called that grass wasted. Now it was the only reason the truck could leave full. The Barrett place sat west of Valentine, a little over 3,000 acres of rolling sandhills grass, low meadow, sandy ridges, and wind that seemed able to find bare soil from a mile away. Lena had grown up there, but she had not grown up in charge. That role had belonged to her father until he died, and after that to a combination of Lena's mother, Paula, and a foreman named Wes Dalton who had worked cattle on the place for almost 30 years. Wes knew the ranch by memory. He knew which windmill needed persuasion after a cold night. He knew where cattle would drift before a storm. He knew which sandy trail could take a loaded trailer, and which one only looked firm until the rear axle sank. He also knew one thing about grass. If cattle could eat it, you used it before the weather did. That rule had kept the place functioning through plenty of hard seasons. It also had a cost that nobody noticed until a dry year stacked every decision on top of the next one. The summer before Lena came home, rain had missed the ranch for weeks. The easy grass went first. Then the cattle were pushed onto pasture that had already been used harder than anyone liked. Paula bought hay early, then bought more after the price rose, then watched freight turn every extra bale into a more expensive decision than the last. Lena was still working range surveys then. She came home for a weekend in September and found the yard crowded with round bales that had arrived on 3 different trucks. Paula sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and feed invoices spread beside the bank statement. Nobody was in danger of losing the ranch that afternoon. The situation was less dramatic and more familiar than that. The operating line was simply tighter. A group of older cows had to be sold before Paula wanted to sell them. A corral repair was postponed. A water project was delayed another year because feed had consumed the money first. Lena remembered looking out the window at a pasture that had been green twice that season and grazed twice that season. There was still grass in it, just not enough useful grass left at the moment they needed it most. That was the problem she carried home with her. Not a belief that hay was bad, not a belief that the old ranchers were foolish, a question about timing. What if the expensive part of drought began months before the ranch actually looked dry? Lena came home after several years doing range surveys and pasture work for other operations. She did not return with a machine that promised to double production. She did not bring a new seed, a miracle fertilizer, or a piece of software that claimed to understand the land better than the people living on it. She brought fence reels, a notebook, a soil thermometer, and a question Wes did not like. How much of the ranch were they grazing before the plants had actually recovered? The old rotation looked organized on paper. Cattle moved from one pasture to the next. When a field looked green again, they could come back. But green was not the same as ready. A plant could push new leaves while the energy stored below ground was still depleted. If an animal returned during that vulnerable regrowth, the plant lost the exact leaf area it needed to rebuild itself. Enough repeated bites did not kill the prairie overnight. They did something more dangerous. They made it weaker so slowly that a rancher could mistake the decline for bad luck. Lena had seen that pattern in her survey work. Short root systems, Open soil, thin litter, pastures that looked acceptable in May and became helpless in August. Her proposal was not complicated. She wanted the herd to stay in smaller grazing areas for shorter periods, then stay out much longer. She wanted portable water to follow the cattle. She wanted a back fence behind them so they could not reach fresh regrowth. And on the north side of the ranch, she wanted to leave one broad block alone through most of the growing season. Paula looked at the map spread across the office desk. How much are you leaving? Just under 500 acres. Wes gave a short laugh. For what? Reserve forage. You mean standing hay? Not exactly. If it's standing and a cow can eat it, it's hay with roots. Lena smiled. Then let's leave it attached to the ground. Wes did not smile back. He pointed at the north block. By August, half of that will be stem. Some of it, quality will drop. Some of it, and you'll still buy hay if it gets dry. Maybe. That answer bothered him more than a promise would have. Wes could argue with confidence. He did not know what to do with a plan that admitted it might fail. Paula ended the discussion. Lena could manage the north half her way for one season. Wes would keep the south rotation mostly as it had been. They would measure grazing dates, recovery, feed purchases, and what the ground looked like after the cattle left. No speeches, no family referendum. One season, the first 6 weeks made Lena look smart. Spring moisture came on time. Grass climbed fast. The portable polywire went up cleanly. Cattle learned to respect it after a few days. Lena moved them before they could circle back to the plants they had already bitten. Then the weather turned hot, and Lena's plan failed exactly where Wes had warned it would fail. Not in theory, but in the places where cattle had to live. One temporary water tank sat too far from the next grazing strip. To reach it, the herd walked the same narrow lane again and again. The sand loosened. Plants disappeared. Manure piled around the water point. When the herd came back to an adjacent section 27 days later, Lena decided the grass looked good enough. It was green. She opened the fence. 3 days later, the tender regrowth had been shaved down harder than anything on Wes's side of the ranch. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not need to. Lena stood at the edge of the lane with her boot in loose sand and felt the weight of the mistake. The cattle had done exactly what cattle do. The failure belonged to the plan. That evening she crossed out the return date she had written on her grazing chart. Not moved it, crossed it out. The number of rest days was not the rule. Recovery was the rule. The next morning, she and Wes hauled a second tank toward the ridge. They laid temporary water lines so the herd would not need the same lane. Lena shifted the fence to keep cattle off the damaged strip and began checking more than color before a pasture reopened. She watched leaf stage. She looked at how much old material still covered the soil. She compared grazed plants with protected plants along the fence. She pushed her fingers beneath the canopy at midday and felt how quickly exposed ground heated compared with shaded ground. Wes watched all of it. "Your notebook tell you when it's ready?" he asked. "No, good. The plants do," he grunted. "That's a better answer." By the end of June, the rain became scattered. By mid-July, it mostly stopped. The Sandhills did not turn brown in one dramatic afternoon. The change came in pieces. A ridge lost its soft green first. Then the south-facing slopes faded. The wind stayed hot after sunset. Hoof prints began to hold their shape longer in dry sand. Stock tanks needed more attention because cattle drank harder in the heat. On the south rotation, Wes still had grass, but each move revealed less behind the next fence. On Lena's side, the rested paddocks were not immune. Growth slowed there too, but more of the soil stayed hidden under leaves, stems, and litter. Places that had been grazed once and then left alone carried more material above the sand. The difference was not lush grass against dead grass, it was time. One side was running out of choices faster. In early July, Paula had placed an order for 24 round bales. Not because the ranch was out of feed, but because she had lived through enough dry summers to know what happened when everyone waited until they were desperate. The price was already climbing. By August, trucks were moving hay across county lines. One neighbor weaned calves early. Another cut a roadside meadow that normally was not worth the diesel. The sale barn filled with cattle from ranches trying to reduce pressure before the grass disappeared completely. Lena walked the North Reserve every few days. The standing forage was mature now. Wes had been right about that. Seed heads had dried. Some stems were coarse. If she had waited for that pasture to remain June quality forever, the plan would have been nonsense. But feed value was only one part of the calculation. There was still leaf. There was still volume. There was still cover on the soil. And there was something the South Side no longer had much of. A place they had not already asked to do too much. On August 17th, Lena clipped sample forage and sent it for a basic feed test. She did not need laboratory results to know the reserve was lower in protein than young summer grass. But she wanted to know how far it had fallen before she depended on it for weeks. The answer confirmed what she expected. The standing feed could carry the cows, but not perfectly on its own. The herd would need targeted protein and mineral support, especially as the forage matured further. Wes read the report at the shop bench. So we buy supplement instead of hay. For now, and if they don't hold condition, we change the plan. And if the pasture runs shorter than you think, we change the plan. He folded the paper once. You say that a lot. Because drought doesn't care what I wrote in April. That afternoon, they opened the first strip of the North Reserve. The cattle did not rush in like starving animals. They walked through the gate, spread out, and began selecting. They stripped leaves from mature bunches. They grazed shorter plants between the taller stems. They knocked down material with their feet as they moved. Wes hated that part. He watched a cow trample a patch she had not eaten and shook his head. There goes a mouthful. Lena looked at the flattened grass. There goes shade. He gave her a sideways glance. Cows don't eat shade. No. But grass grows under it. That evening, the ground beneath the trampled layer was noticeably cooler than the open sand beside a heavily used trail. The crushed stems were not wasted in the same way a bale dropped off a truck would be wasted. They had changed jobs. Some became feed, some became cover, and the cattle moved on before they could return for the first tender regrowth. 2 days later, Lena called the hay supplier and tried to cancel the order. The message never reached the driver. So on August 19th, 24 bales still arrived. That was why the truck stopped in the Barrett drive and found Lena waving it down. The driver looked from her to the pale hills. You sure? Lena looked toward the North Ridge. Ask me again in October. He left with the load. For the next several weeks, the Barrett herd moved through the reserve in controlled pieces. When a strip was finished, it was closed behind them. They did not stretch a paddock until every edible stem disappeared. They left enough material to protect the ground and enough time behind the herd for plants to recover if moisture returned. The ranch did not escape the drought. That mattered. The mature forage lost quality. The supplement bill went up. One shallow water source weakened earlier than expected, forcing Lena and Wes to haul water for several days while they changed the grazing sequence. A late summer windstorm dropped a section of temporary fence, and the herd spent half a night where it did not belong. There were no miracle acres. There were only acres that had not been spent yet. By the time the ranch finally began feeding hay, the nights were colder and the worst of the summer pressure was over. Paula's feed records showed they had started later than she had budgeted and had purchased far fewer emergency bales than she feared in July. But the number that mattered most to Lena was not the hay total. It was the fact that they had never reached the week when every choice was bad at once. They had not been forced to dump cattle into a tired pasture because there was nowhere else to go. They had not bought the most expensive hay simply because they were out of time. They had not grazed the North Block in June just because it looked ready to use. They had kept options long enough to make decisions instead of reactions. The first hard frost came in October. A month later, freezing rain sealed part of the standing forage under crusted ice. For 2 days, the cattle could not use it efficiently. Wes rolled hay out on frozen ground before sunrise. When Lena arrived, she found him cutting twine from a bale. He looked at her and grinned. "So much for grass with roots," Lena laughed. "That's why we kept some grass without roots." The winter forced another correction. Stockpiled forage could reduce dependence on hay. It could not erase snow crust, low protein, weak water, or the needs of a cow in poor condition. The next year's plan kept standing reserve, but it also kept a smaller, deliberate hay cushion instead of treating bought feed as either failure or salvation. That distinction changed the ranch more than Lena expected. They stopped asking how to eliminate hay. They asked when hay was the best tool, and when it was covering for grazing decisions made months earlier. The following spring was wet. Nothing looked dramatic. Grass grew on Lena's side. Grass grew on Wes's side. The damaged water lane greened up slowly after being rested. The North Reserve recovered so well that a person driving past at 60 miles an hour would have learned absolutely nothing from the view. That year taught them almost as much as the drought. A grazing system could look brilliant when weather punished the old habit, and ordinary when rain covered everyone's mistakes. So they kept measuring. They shifted another water point. They widened one lane. They shortened a few grazing periods during fast spring growth and lengthened recovery when summer slowed. They used the forage test again before relying heavily on mature stockpile. They watched cow condition instead of assuming the pasture was doing its job because the map said it should. Wes became the hardest person on the ranch to impress. That was useful. If Lena proposed opening a pasture because 45 days had passed, he would ask what the plants looked like. If she wanted to save a block because the plan said reserve, he would ask whether the herd could actually use it with the water available. If she talked about soil cover, he would kick apart the litter and look underneath. He never became a man who loved theories. He became a man who wanted proof before he spent grass. 2 summers after the hay truck left full, another dry spell settled over the Sandhills. This one started earlier. The ranch still made hard choices. They weaned part of the calf crop sooner than they wanted. They reduced pressure on one vulnerable pasture. They bought some hay before prices climbed further. But the reserve grass was there again, not as a rescue story, but as one tool among several. The ranch had learned the difference between conserving forage and pretending forage was unlimited. Late the next May, Lena drove out after 3 days of warm rain and found Wes standing at a gate on the north side. An orange tag hung from the chain. Lena had started using those tags to mark pastures that were closed for recovery. Wes pulled it off, turned it over in his hand, then looked across the grass. Lena expected him to open the gate. Instead, he walked 20 yards into the pasture, knelt beside a grazed bunchgrass plant, and separated the new leaves with his fingers. He stayed there for a moment. Then he came back, hooked the chain, and hung the orange tag on the gate again. "Another week," he said. Lena nodded. They drove away and left the grass standing.